Stay from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
President Macron says we can no longer depend on others for our security, on land, in the air and at sea. He's having a big dig at NATO and he's saying we need to have European defence forces. Is he right? Have the Americans really abandoned us and NATO? We'll debate that this evening. We'll talk about gas. Is there any sign of the British government waking up to the fact we've got to stop importing gas? And I say that as two Russian gas tankers head for Kent ports. And joining me to talk on Talking Pints, Will Geddes, security expert, and I'll be asking him, how safe are the oligarchs who are now living in Britain? Before all of that, let's get the news.
Hello, I'm Miranda Shunker with the latest from the GB newsroom. Ukraine continues to be bombarded with attacks on day 8 of the invasion. Russian troops are around 15 miles outside Kiev's city centre. Elsewhere, the mayor of Mariupol is warning Russian forces have surrounded the port city and severed rail links. At least 33 civilians have been killed in a Russian airstrike in the northern city of Chernihiv. Ukrainian forces are battling Russian troops for control of Enerhodar, which has Europe's largest nuclear plant. And while Russia claims it's captured Kherson, Ukraine maintains its forces are continuing to defend the Black Sea port. A Ukrainian negotiator says the second round of ceasefire talks with Russia have not yielded the results Kiev had hoped for, but that a third round of talks will take place at the start of next week. The Russian president claims his military has offered safe corridors so civilians can escape the war, but warned his military goals in Ukraine will be achieved. The Ukrainian president says he will not surrender, but that some compromises must be found so that people do not die. Well, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees says in just 7 days, 1 million people have fled Ukraine.
I have worked in refugee emergencies for almost 40 years, and rarely have I seen an exodus as rapid as this one. Peace is the only way to halt this tragedy.
The International Criminal Court is launching an investigation into alleged war crimes. It follows reports that cluster and vacuum bombs have been dropped in residential areas. Moscow denies it's targeting civilians. Back here, 2 British supermarkets have stopped selling a Russian-made vodka as a sign of solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Co-op and Morrison's say Russian Standard, which is distilled in St. Petersburg, will no longer be on the shelves. Former Education Secretary Gavin Williamson has been given a knighthood. Downing Street says the Queen has approved the honour for the Tory MP, who has twice been sacked from the government. And voting is underway in the Birmingham-Erdington by-election following the death of Labour frontbencher Jack Dromey. 12 candidates are standing for the seat, with a result expected later this evening. On TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Farage.
Good evening. Well, in Ukraine, Russian forces continue to make progress, steady progress, albeit whilst taking pretty considerable casualties. Peace talks once again have been held on the Belarus border. They haven't yielded much, but a tentative agreement that there should be some corridors opened for civilians to leave and for emergency aid and medicine to get in, with the possibility of a ceasefire around those corridors. Not that significant, perhaps just mildly optimistic, but no more. But what really interested me today was President Macron, yes, Emmanuel Macron, who held a long conversation, once again, with Vladimir Putin. No doubt he's trying to sort of position himself as being the great peacemaker ahead of the French presidential elections, which come in a couple of months' time. And his spokesman after the talk said that this is going to get worse. There is worse to come. That was worrying. But another statement was issued in which Macron said, "We can no longer depend on others to defend us, be it on land, at sea, under the sea, in the air, in space, or in cyberspace. To this end, our European defence must step up." Now, the French have, for a long time, been pretty chippy about NATO. Indeed, they left NATO in 1966. Famously, the American president went to Paris, met with President de Gaulle, and he was told, the American president, he was told that the French wanted not just to leave NATO, but they wanted all American troops off French soil. That was the demand from President de Gaulle as they left. And in response, the American president said, "Does that include the dead ones?" Reference, of course, to the massive cost, the huge cost that America had made to defend France in 2 world wars. So they left NATO, they became then a political member of NATO, they once again then became a full member of NATO. But what Macron's saying here is that NATO's gone. This narrative I heard every single day in the European Parliament ever since the election of Donald Trump. The false narrative that Trump wanted America to leave NATO. But what it's all about are the federalist aims of the European Union, and there is no greater cheerleader for it than Emmanuel Macron. They want their own European Defence Union. They want, effectively, their own EU army. Now, there are some that are arguing that what's happened in Ukraine in the last week or so shows the need for that. I would suggest that provided that NATO is fit and strong and America is still a part of it, provided those things are in place, well then I can't see the need to set up a parallel command structure, which would be confusing for member states, as effectively no man can serve 2 masters. Now, Joe Biden may not have been particularly impressive in his State of the Union speech, but he did say this about NATO.
The United States and our allies will defend every inch of territory that is NATO territory with the full force of our collective power. Every single inch.
Well, that seems fairly clear to me. Every single inch of NATO territory will be defended. So why are the French doing this, other than their political ambitions for the European Union project? Well, joining me now to discuss this is General Rob Spalding, former senior director at the National Security Strategy Council, and you were the author, I believe, in 2017 of a very important document all around national security. General Spalding, welcome to GB News.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So the French, once again, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but a French president casting doubts on whether America is still committed to the NATO project. And I suspect this latest skepticism comes in the wake of what happened in Afghanistan last year. Because let's be frank about it, it was a NATO mission. It went on for 20 years, and the Americans withdrew unilaterally without consulting their allies. So I guess in one way, Macron does have a point, doesn't he?
Well, I think, we can certainly look to that as not the best way that the United States should have dealt with the ending of the Afghanistan war. But I think we have more important things to deal with, and that is, are we going to be unified in the face of growing authoritarianism, or are we going to be divided? So there's a lot of ways that we can be divided. We can be divided in defense of Europe, between the EU and between NATO. We can be divided between the United States and between NATO. And we can be divided between national security and economic benefit. And I think all of those are ways that both the Russians and Chinese are choosing to separate us in the time when we need to be coming together. So I think NATO is more important than ever, but insufficient. In other words, we need to work together economically, in trade, finance.
I've lost a bit of volume there, which is a great shame. General Spalding, the point that he was making is actually, he made the point that NATO, he just said, is more important than ever. And, you know, this is a former senior director of the National Security Council of the United States of America. And both parties, both the Republicans and the Democrats, are absolutely firm and absolutely clear that they are part of NATO. They will defend NATO territory. And yes, we were all pretty upset by their behaviour last year. Maybe, just maybe, Joe Biden and this administration have learnt something of a lesson from that. I don't know. I hope they have. I believe they have. Let's get back with General Spaulding. I lost you there for a moment, sir. I'm sorry. You were making the point that in many ways NATO is more important now than ever. Let me ask you this. Is it possible to have NATO headquartered in Brussels and a European Union defence union quartered in Brussels?
Well, I think when it comes to military command and control and strategy, having a divided leadership and divided forces has never worked. And in fact, that's why we went through in the United States something called the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which sought to unify forces under one commander. So, no, I don't think you could have a fractured command in terms of military. But as I was saying, it's not just military. Economically, trade, financially, academically, politically, we need to be unified as a free world together, opposing the Russians and Chinese and authoritarianism that's rising and spreading everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, there seems to be no sign, certainly with us, in terms of the Biden administration of putting a trade deal together. So you would argue that actually trade, security, defense, all these things should work hand in glove.
Absolutely. If you're going to say that Putin is a problem, then buying Russian gas is a big problem, and then not sanctioning the Chinese when they are providing the relief valve for Russian gas is an even bigger problem. You know, we have spent 30 years tying ourselves economically, particularly to China. China's supporting Russia. They're trying to play like they're not, but they actually are. They're buying their gas. They're giving them the relief valve that they need when Nord Stream 2, for example, was shut off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And let me ask you one more question, slightly different sphere, but a similar theme, and a very hard question. But it's been noticeable just how loud the Chinese noise has become around Taiwan. You know, quite repeatedly, state television saying Taiwan is a part of China, period. What do we do? What does America, I mean, you know, America's made some guarantees, but what do we do as a Western world if China tries to move on Taiwan?
Most Americans aren't aware that it was actually a Brit, Prime Minister Churchill, that came to America and said, we've got a problem. He gave the Iron Curtain speech, not in Europe, he gave it in St. Louis. Yep. And so what we need to recognize is we're in Cold War number 2, and this is going to be a long drawn out struggle. I don't think we're going to be able to stop the Chinese from invading Taiwan, just like we weren't able to stop Putin from invading Ukraine. In fact, I think that's the pact between the two. In other words, China's going to look the other way while they move into Ukraine, just don't do it during the Olympics. And then they're going to go into Taiwan and Russia's going to support that. So that's the world we have to face. It's just like Berlin, you know, in 1948. We're going to have to think about how do we rescue people that need to be rescued? How do we resupply? Just like we're doing with Ukraine now. But ultimately, it's going to be a long-term struggle between the forces of good against the forces of evil.
General Spaulding, thank you very much for joining us and giving us those words. And there we are. There was General Spaulding saying what I've been saying for a very, very long time. If they go on full steam ahead and create a European defence union, it will directly conflict with NATO. And yet it seems there are some within the European Union quite happy to say goodbye to America, who in their own Walter Mitty way think somehow the European Union can provide the right level of defence. I don't believe that it can. Well, I'm joined now by somebody who's becoming, well, pretty much a regular, I guess, on this programme, is Adam Holloway, Conservative Member of Parliament for Gravesham. And, of course, you've just got back from your trip to Poland and into Ukraine. And thank you for broadcasting into us. earlier this week. It was great stuff. You're not in too much trouble in Westminster, I hope.
Truly, I don't think I'm in trouble at all. I think it was a typical, what I think your viewers would call mainstream media, sort of non-story. Someone asked at a press conference whether or not an MP should travel, and someone said they shouldn't break the travel advice. As I've said, I quite agree with that. We shouldn't break the travel advice, but I think sometimes it is necessary.
Yeah, well, it was the Daily Mirror one.
And it's advice as well.
Yeah, it was the Daily Mirror who sort of...
Well, most of them, actually.
But anyway, but you're here. So, Adam, let's start with... we saw some of your testimony on the ground, which was powerful, about people volunteering, genuinely wanting to fight. Was your impression, as 40-mile columns were approaching Kyiv and everything, was it your impression that the will of the people was holding?
So I was talking to a 3-star general, and he said that the Russians' behaviour had done something that he didn't think would ever be possible, and that was it had united the Ukrainians. And definitely that's what I felt. I stress I was not in Kiev. I was in the big western city.
Yeah.
So, the will is absolutely there. Whether the means are is different. I mean, the reality is, and people can't see, but there's a map on Nigel's desk with all the various little front areas that the Russians are moving. So this is a massive, massive operation by a very, very significant military power against the Ukrainians, who are doing amazingly. They've been modernising their army, obviously, for a while. They've got modern, capable armed forces. They're receiving a lot of help from other countries. I think, a couple of dozen almost are doing this.
Yeah.
But, they are fighting against the Russians, and that's a big deal.
By all accounts, the anti-tank weapon, the new anti-tank weapon that we've developed in conjunction with some Swedish technology, that appears to be very effective.
It's very effective, but the critical point is it's also very easy to use, because there are loads of weapon systems out there. But the one thing the Ukrainians can't do now is suddenly get weapons that they haven't been trained on, because at the moment they can't take people out of the fighting to learn how to use complicated new systems. They can only use either things that are new ones that are very simple, or ones that they're familiar with. So one of the things being talked up at the moment is the need for aircraft. And there's talk about countries that still use Soviet-era equipment that the Ukrainians obviously know how to use, and that those actually being lent to Ukraine now to be flown by Ukrainian pilots. Because, again, nobody sane is saying that the West, that NATO should actually get involved in the fight. The Ukrainians could do that themselves, but we've got to give them the kit to do it.
Although if you're Romania or Bulgaria and you've got a couple of dozen jets, you might think, actually, given what's going on, we might want to keep them here.
As ever, you're spot on. I mean, look, that's a very, very good point. So what has to happen if, say, Romania gives up its, however many MiGs it's got, then we have to have some air defence guarantee for them. So we should bring in a modern air defence system.
And NATO could do that.
And NATO could do that. But as I said to you, I think, was it last night, the night before last, what they're screaming for is air defence systems. And indeed, I mean, in this notebook, I've got their shopping list of equipment. What's really striking is they actually know where the air defence systems that they want are. For example, they want a load from Finland. Finland recently upgraded its system, and its old system, which is called the Book system, they've actually got them in warehouses. The Ukrainians desperately want those because they've got Book already, and they know how to use them.
Well, as you say, they are getting help. They're going to need an awful lot more, by the looks of it. Very tough fight on their hands. Some thoughts on the Emmanuel Macron comments, and you saw what our American general had to say in response. What is it with the French?
When you mentioned this before the programme, I just thought the sheer ingratitude. I mean, look at the way America's basically underwritten European defence since the Second World War.
For 70
Yeah, and now is not the time to raise your kind of, supra-national politics, when actually we are, we have a major war in Europe. Yeah. This is really not the time to be doing it. To say that the Americans aren't doing anything, I mean, I'm sure the Russians can see from their satellites and their spies. I mean, I was down in southeastern Poland at an airport last night, and those were American planes I saw, American transport planes.
Okay.
This is the height of ingratitude.
Yeah. So President Macron, please have a good, cold, hard look at the reality.
Yeah, or some satellite photographs, some southeast Polish airports.
Yeah. Well, he's busy fighting an election campaign. Adam, serious point. This refugee, huge train of people, remarkable the way that countries like Poland are dealing with this, and families are taking women and children in, and, you know, it hasn't led to huge refugee camps. I mean, it's very, very impressive what the Poles are doing. 1 million have crossed that border so far. Some experts think it could be as many as 4 million by the time this is all over. I mean, goodness knows. They're vast, vast numbers. What should we do?
You're absolutely right. I mean, I spent like 5 hours killing time in a little town in southeast Poland yesterday before going to get a flight. And there were 2 demonstrations in support of the refugees. And you'd see people wheeling bags being taken into hotels by the Poles. I mean, the Poles have been extraordinary. And then when you're at the border, you see thousands of women and children. I mean, it's really a remarkable sight. But of course, the men between 18 and 60 are being kept, potentially to fight. So these are not the relatively rich economic migrants who call themselves refugees, who cross over from Calais completely uncontrolled. I mean, I lived once undercover in the old Sangatte camp in Calais. And honestly, then, and I believe now, 99% of these people who are doing exactly what I do the same if I was from a poorer country, but they are economic migrants, not refugees. Whereas these people really are refugees. And I think that we can afford to be really very generous with the Ukrainians, because this is not of their doing, and their menfolk are fighting this war on our behalf because we cannot get involved. So I have no issue with potentially, many, many, many tens of thousands coming here, because they'll return. That's where their families are. And we have to have a different category of asylum that doesn't mean that you stay here forever.
So it will be a year, 2 years,
whatever it is. But, we must do this.
Adam Holloway, thank you for becoming a regular on this show this week. It's been terrific.
Can I make 2 more points, if I may, Nigel?
Go on.
One, it strikes me that part of this problem has been caused by the environmental lobby and our opposition to fracking, for example. Britain should start fracking immediately.
Okay.
And my next point, since this is the first time I've seen you since Brexit, I'm genuinely embarrassed that you haven't been recognised and given a peerage or something for your remarkable service to our country.
Very sweet of you. Thank you, Adam. And I will be talking later on in this programme about a Conservative politician who's been knighted today, and it is truly extraordinary. In a moment, we'll talk about that very subject of gas dependency, how we're going to get back to producing our own gas, and some good news for UK financial services.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
So once again, Macron argues for a European defence union, a European army. I'm asking you whether that's a good idea. Tony says the reason the EU likes the idea of its own army is that it's cheaper and they would control it. Well, that's what they want to do, but could they actually do it properly? Another viewer says the EU needs to become a member of NATO. Most EU member states are in NATO, so what's the point of a separate command structure? How would it work? They would be in conflict. It's mad. No, I get. The world doesn't need more large, centrally controlled armies. NATO works because it's based on national cooperation, which puts a brake on authoritarian misuse. Absolutely. Anthea says, we've got NATO, it doesn't require a separate EU army. And David says, we in the UK don't have one of our own. Our intelligence is far superior as well. So if the EU want an army, go ahead. But they've had enough of British taxpayers' money, I agree. Now, this issue of gas, importing gas, needing more and more gas, and of course the reason for that is because we're relying on wind energy so much that when the wind turbines don't blow on days like this, we burn a lot of gas. And there are 2 tankers from Russia on their way to Kent ports due to dock this weekend. Is there anything we can do to change this debate? Well, Angela Knight, former CEO of Energy UK and former Treasury Economic Secretary, joins me. Angela, thank you for coming back on the programme and being a friend of it. We've discussed this before, but now that we've had these events in Ukraine, soaring oil and gas prices, is there any way we can change this government's mind?
I honestly think that events have got to change the government's mind. In this instance, what I mean about the government's mind is actually having a much deeper think and proper think about what energy policy should be, because we have been operating on the basis that there's been a large amount of cheap wholesale market gas. It'll just come in, and so there's been no problem. But of course, that's only times is good policy. We're in times are bad. And when you see that even Germany, who's been absolutely against nuclear power, deciding not to close down its nuclear power stations, and when you see them digging up more coal, it does show that even in that country, who arguably has had for many years the worst possible energy policy, worse in Europe than anybody I can think of, realization has dawned. Now, with us, what we've got to do, in my view, is, yes, make ourselves far more self-sufficient as far as what we use in the way of energy, which means that we have got to look at fracking, we've got to look at filling up our stores, we've got to look at doing more drilling at the North Sea. That will take a bit of time. But right now, what I would do is not shut down anything more. That is, keep our old coal-fired power stations going and keeping our nuclear power stations going, because one thing I suspect that government is thinking about is this, Nigel, that we have taken electricity from Europe through interconnectors for some years. The EU is in a worse situation than the UK. I think that those interconnectors are not going to run in our direction, which means we've actually got to be really take that into account. We're coming into the warmer time of year. Good.
The logic, Andrew, of what you say is absolutely right. You know, there's a huge risk there, as you say. The EU will look after themselves before they export electricity to us. I get that. But what is it going to take to change Boris Johnson's mind?
Well, you see, I'm of a firm belief that these are things which obviously they're looking at right now, because self-evidently you are elected by people. And if people find that the policies that you as the government are pursuing are not working for them, then you're going to change, aren't you? And there's 2 things here, of course, Nigel. One is, are we secure on getting the energy we need? And the second is, and at what price? Actually, I do think we're pretty secure on the energy we need, but the price inevitably is going to increase. And that's something that has to be addressed, and getting it getting as much energy from our own resources is at least a key important measure in both those 2 points.
Well, as you say, they're elected by the people, and if the people make their feelings felt, they will have to change. Change of tack, perhaps a rather more optimistic story, a happy story. One of the complaints that Brexiteers have had, and indeed Remainers have had, is that we were supposed to get great benefits in leaving the European Union. That was what the Leave campaign said, in terms of regulation that wasn't appropriate for this country, and very little has happened. The government argue, well, the pandemic has kept them fully busy. But City Minister John Glenn, MP, speaking to the Treasury Select Committee and talking about Solvency II, which is an EU directive, and indeed about MiFID II. Now, look, I know that no one at home knows what these things are, but they are EU regulations that were designed for 28 countries, imposed upon our insurance industry, our equities industry. Is John Glenn on the right lines?
Totally. I spent 10 years, Nigel, going to Brussels more or less every month, arguing the toss for, first of all, financial services industry in the UK on regulation, and then secondly, for the energy industry. And of course, you do come across two very big things. The first is they don't structure their industry the same as us by any manner of means. And the second is that when they think about what's international, what's cross-border, it's one European country to another. The UK cross-border is to the world. Now, if I can just pick up on those two financial services things, what both of them do is they add very significantly the costs to doing business, the costs of insurance that you and I pay. Solvency II might sound the sort of thing which you say, what on earth are you talking about? Yep. But the reality is it adds very significantly to the cost of insurance. Why has the UK got one of the biggest global insurance industries? And the answer is because we know how to do lots of different things. And what the EU has done with that Solvency II is constrained our industry, increased our costs. Review it, and you'll still get a secure industry, but you'll get one that's more dynamic. MiFID II, that's all about trading. People say, well, do I care about trading? Well, actually, you might not, but your pension fund does. You know, the idea that you can just get what you need to buy what you need to buy is sort of fundamental to us with shops. Well, for the financial service industry, has to be fundamental to them. So reviewing these two equals a very good thing. There'll still be rules and regulations in place, but unnecessary rules and unnecessary costs get swept away. Good to John Glenn and good to the government on this.
And good for you for explaining that in terms that everybody can understand. It's a great story. It's a good piece of news. And thank you very much. No, you did very well, I promise you. Thank you. Well, I'm really pleased about that. You know, financial services, and you hear that term because, it's all bankers and all the rest of it. No, financial services isn't just the City of London. Every major town and city in this country has offices that do insurance, look after pension funds. Financial services is the biggest single employer in this country. I believe passionately, as I went into the European Parliament in 1999, and I did from the financial services industry, I believe right back then it was holding us back, putting up costs, and I argued that consistently for many, many years, and at last something is being done. Thank goodness for that. What a real What the Farage moment. So you may remember, going back a little bit, that it was decided that OneWeb would be nationalised. OneWeb would get bought out by the British taxpayer, which it was at a cost of about £400 million. It was something Dominic Cummings thought was vital for us. And this was our means of putting satellites up into space so that we can head towards a space broadband network. Now, look, the reward of that would be phenomenal. Any of you watching or listening to this that live in rural areas that have got terrible internet will know, and probably very bad mobile phone signal too, will know exactly what I mean. And we have 36 satellites ready to go as we move towards this. But unfortunately, these satellites are due to be launched this week from a base in Russia. And Roscosmos, the Russian state space agency, is refusing to allow the launch of those satellites unless the British government sells its stake in OneWeb and receives assurances that the business of those satellites will not be used for military purposes. So in effect, our 36 satellites are being held hostage by the Russians. There you are. There are consequences to all of these things. My other What the Farage, what is it about modelling? What is it about people who produce graphs, who do 5 o'clock briefings designed to scare the life out of all of us? And when Omicron came along, despite the fact the South Africans told us it wasn't going to be a great problem, no, it was going to be a disaster. In fact, the Prime Minister addressed the nation on a Sunday evening and 4 times used the word emergency. Well, what were the predictions? We were told by Sage that up to 10,000 people a day could enter hospital because of Omicron, and that deaths could peak at 6,000 a day. In fact, the highest death number, and they're all sad, they're all bad, they're all horrible, but the highest death number was 300 a day. And Sage have now admitted that they failed to accurately predict the numbers. Yes, they failed to predict the numbers. They got it wrong once again. They get it wrong every time. And my final What the Farage moment is, I do just find it incredible that Gavin Williamson, who was sacked as Defence Secretary for leaking to the press things that should have been secrets, who then went on to become the Minister for Education, who announced a brand new plan for A-level marking during the pandemic. That was held up to be rubbish. He U-turned shortly afterwards. He was got rid of, double sacked from the cabinet. He is to become Sir Gavin Williamson. You really couldn't make some of this stuff up. A couple more thoughts from you on Emmanuel Macron. Neil says, we have NATO, complete with its own HQ command and communication structures, tactics and procedures. We have a specific role and permanent commitments. Our tiny military cannot be fragmented and stretched any more than they already are. Charlie says, under Macron's idea for a European army, who will give the order for that army to go to war? If this has to be unanimous amongst all members, there is fat chance of any action being taken. And finally, Camilla says, all members of the EU should become members of NATO. Finland and Sweden are particularly vulnerable, but would be protected under its umbrella. Well, there is an argument for that, but of course, if you let Finland in, once again, you're back to the argument of pushing up against Russian borders. But I guess that Putin's aggression means that argument is now somewhat redundant. In a moment, joining me for Talking Pints, Will Geddes, security expert. I'm going to ask him about the oligarchs living in the UK. Just how safe are they if they've turned against Vladimir Putin?
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows. Every day, we ask the questions that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
The bell has rung, the GB News Tavern is open, and I'm joined by security specialist Will Geddes on Talking Pints. Will, welcome to the programme.
Cheers, good sir. Thank you for the invite.
Good to see you. There was a lot to talk about in terms of security, in terms of the war that's going on in Ukraine, what the role perhaps of mercenaries is going to be in all of that, what happens to Russian oligarchs who speak out against. I had a lot to talk about. But, Will, all the people I've met before working in this field of, whether it's close protection or doing risk analyses over the world, all of them are ex-army types. And you're not, are you?
No, I'm a dirty civvy, as they would call it, Nigel. I'm within that category of the weird and wonderful, which proved a challenge in, obviously, my growth in this industry. Because, obviously, when I walked in the door of many of my clients, who are now, many of which are good friends, they would turn around and say, so, Will, which regiment were you in? Or which police force were you in? Yeah. And when you go, neither, they kind of got a startled gaze in their eyes and went, I don't know which box to put you in.
So how do you get into this industry? How do you make a start if you haven't got that background?
Well, I do mentor quite a few civilians who want to come into the industry, and there are an awful lot of civilians. You don't have to necessarily have come from a military background, although depending on which end of the sector you are operating will depend on, obviously, the skill sets that you can either bring to the game straight away, or you can develop, as I have over the years. So it's an interesting industry. It's made up of I would say that there's no one particular background which would necessarily precede someone else. I think if you have the right mindset, if you're willing to learn, you get on with other people, which I hope I do, then there's every good chance for you to develop. So, there are guys out there who are trying to get in. But for me, I came in as a close protection officer, as a bodyguard initially. That's how I started. I'd had a background in martial arts, and I set up a company in the UK after spending some time overseas providing bodyguarding for basically personal protection, but also personal protection training, and worked with a number of big blue chip companies. And then from there, I had a very, very, very good mentor, one of the great and the good from B Squadron in 22 SAS, an amazing chap who was my mentor, very close friend, was very harsh and brutal on me, but taught me an awful lot about the industry. And then from there, as the business grew, got to know lots of other people, and I think one of the skills you have to have in this industry is to be a sponge and just literally draw as much information as you can.
I think in life.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I think in life. It's why work from home was so objectionable, because particularly young people getting into any business, they learn from older people, they learn from experience, they absorb information. I hope those days are firmly behind us.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I mean, in this country, it's interesting, isn't it? There are a lot more rock stars, very well-known footballers, whatever it is. And I, of course, had it myself for many years and still have to be thoughtful about where I go and what I do. A lot more people now need some form or feel they need some form of protection in this country. It's as if the barriers between us, the normal barriers, have been broken down, I think, by social media. And, the chance of being accosted now is higher than it ever was. So that end of the industry, I guess, is booming.
Well, it is, and I mean, I think it's right across the board, because even if you're not a celebrity, many people are engaging in social media. So, as you say, I remember when Twitter first came out, one of the biggest challenges was I remember getting calls from people in the public eye who'd say, Will, I have no idea how someone knew I was at this restaurant or I was at this location. Right. And they'd forgotten and didn't know at that time how to control their devices and their privacy and not give out their location unknowingly to, obviously, those that had a vested interest or were fixated people. And it doesn't have to be a celebrity and stalkers. It could be an aggrieved former partner or someone who's stalking that person because of an acrimonious business deal. So there are so many different ways that we've opened ourselves up. You're absolutely right, Nigel, in terms of our availability or potential access to other people.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, I was somebody with a very controversial opinion. So controversial, it got a majority in a referendum. But hey, but it was, and you're in a restaurant, and someone tweets that you're there, and if you're not on the ball, you can have a problem very, very quickly, and that's where you need to have somebody looking after you, checking social media and everything else. Before we go on to the international dimensions of this, which I suspect when we come to Ukraine, there's going to be a lot to talk about. What about the security of our kids in terms of what they see online, where they go? What can parents do to try and protect their children?
Well,
that really is a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, without giving a cheap plug, I did write a book about it a couple of years ago.
I know.
I think fundamentally what we've got to understand, and I was talking to one of the schools. I do quite a bit of sort of talks to schools and particularly to little ones about what they have to be aware of in terms of their growing digital footprint and the profile that they're projecting. And that back in our day, Nigel, thankfully we lived in the time of 35mm and Instamatics, and our childhood and our adolescence wasn't documented in the same way.
Thank goodness.
I know, absolutely. I think I'd be locked up today if that was the case. But I think for kids, they don't realise that, maybe an interview they go to in 10 years' time, their employer is going to look at their Facebook history, their Instagram history, their digital profile. And removing this stuff is really difficult, very, very, very hard. And people don't understand that the law actually doesn't work as well as one might imagine. And this right for privacy and removing things from Google, it's not that straightforward. So what I fundamentally say, and as I did to this school I was talking to today, is about parents really understanding that they can't use it for virtual nannying. They have to engage themselves in that child's digital life as much as they do in their real life. So if the child says, I'm talking to Jemima or Harry or Fred or whatever, in the same way as if they said, well, I'm going to go off and play with Harry, Jemima or Fred, they'd say, well, how do you know them? Do you know them from school or anything else? Don't just think because they're online, they don't necessarily pose as much of a threat, if not more of a threat. So it's about a parent talking with their child, having a constant dialogue, understanding what they're enjoying, what they're not enjoying, what frightens them, and understanding also in terms of content, what is seen can never be unseen. So don't venture out and look for that material.
And we've had that, there was, I won't name him, but an England cricketer, plays his first test match, and it turns out years before, when he's a teenager, he's written something on social media that isn't very savoury. But very difficult to tell 13-year-olds.
Yeah.
That every picture you take with your friends, very, very hard, isn't it?
It's almost impossible. I don't say entirely impossible, but it's almost impossible. But it's again down to trust. I think the other thing as well is teamwork with the child. And it's, I don't endorse putting spyware on your child's software, on their phones or on their iPads. Because if the child has that kind of either spyware or parental controls, they only see that as something to defeat and trying to overcome. So it's about saying to the child, look, I trust you with this device. But the one thing I always have to drum into parents, and they're the worst generally, and as the old saying goes, and this is probably an awful analogy, there's no such thing as a bad dog, only a bad owner. So I say to the parents, look, you're giving your child this device, and until such time as that child can pay for that device and the running of that device, it's a loaner.
Yeah, I can see the complaints coming in now. It is compared children to dogs. I can see it.
I know. Yeah, parental groups in uproar.
But that is, it is a big area. Will, you've worked across the world. You've worked in some very dangerous places. You've been kidnapped once or twice.
Attempts that I'd admit to. Yeah, no, I spent a good bit of time in Iraq. Yeah. That was a pretty hairy experience. Spent almost 3 years on and off there, helping some companies, obviously, in redeveloping the country and trying to put in some infrastructure. Spent some time in Afghanistan, on and off for about 2 years. Some other hairy places around the world, Mexico, the more dangerous countries within Africa, for example. So yeah, I learned an awful lot over my years. Made a few mistakes here and there, learned by those mistakes, thankfully still alive, still don't have any holes in me. Yeah. So, and a few scars, but that's about it. But that's probably the ex-wife.
This is looking after commercial companies mostly, is it?
It is, yeah. I mean, we've done a little bit of government work. I obviously can't talk a great deal about that.
Sure.
But a lot of it is commercial, and particularly for companies that are operating in, what one could call high risk or hostile environments, and helping them sort of run those operations. But there's been a lot of response to extortions, to kidnappings, ransomwares of all various types.
Yeah, of course.
That's kind of bread and butter business, to be honest.
Yeah. Now, I'm hearing stories that there are quite a lot of, not about you, no. I'm hearing stories, no, I've saved those. But no, I'm hearing stories that there are potentially quite a few mercenary teams being hired to go off to the conflict in Ukraine. What's the story?
Okay, so there's two sides to this. There's the side for us industry, because, you know, ourselves, my company, a lot of other companies, we all draw from the same pool that is known as the circuit. And a lot of these guys are wanting to go down and join the fight. They've come back from Afghanistan and they've got the fire in the belly and they are warriors and they want to go and obviously do what they do best. Some are going down there, I know some are being paid about £1,000 a month to basically contribute and assist down there, and that's through Ukraine assets. There are the others, which are run by private military companies, similar to my own, where individuals are being offered proper salaries to go and operate, obviously, in Ukraine. And this is a kind of a proxy means of dealing with the Russian threat, obviously, in the Ukraine. And it's a very interesting angle at the moment, because those PMCs, which are generally offshore, are being financed, and it's literally comparable and in parallel to, say, the Wagner Group, or Wagner Group.
We talked about last night.
Yeah, which is basically a plausible deniability mercenary unit that Putin uses. They are disassociated to the Kremlin, but all the dots join that it is evidently a third-party operation. So similar, whereas maybe we can't get involved in a visible sense. To say we're not involved in the fight, we are very much involved in the fight. Even if we haven't got troops on the ground, we're involved in the fight. But this is a means of getting combat troops in there through private military companies that may be allegedly sponsored by countries.
Is there a moral question around all of this, around the hiring of mercenaries? A lot of people would think there is.
I'm probably the wrong person to ask.
Well, no, I'm just saying that a lot of people would say, well, there's a moral question here to answer, and that actually, in some ways, governments kind of shirk their responsibilities by letting mercenaries do jobs for them, which does happen, doesn't it?
Well, politically, it could be a much easier solution, because rather than the government have to go into confrontation, which could then precipitate a worse reaction from Putin, and we know at the moment he is acting like a true megalomaniac, and if he'd taken Donetsk and Lyshansk and literally controlled the eastern part of Ukraine, which we all kind of forecasted that he potentially might,
that part.
Set up its own independence and democratically, albeit probably with some puppet leader that's beholden to the Kremlin. For him to move further into the Ukraine, and his objective, as far as we can tell, is probably to take all the major cities, which will then move it on to an insurgent level, and then we're talking about an insurgency. That is where mercenary forces are actually incredibly beneficial, because there isn't a kind of a visible engagement by NATO in a country that is a NATO partner.
Yeah.
But you have got combat forces that are well equipped, well experienced, to be able to assist and support the Ukrainian people. So
I get the point. Will Gators, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much,
Talking
sir.
Pints. Great stuff.
Cheers.
We are reaching the end of the programme. It's Barrage the Farage. You've sent your questions in. Let me have my go at answering them. Louise asks me, do you think there is any way in which Putin can be held accountable for war crimes that have been committed in his name? Lots of talk about that. We saw this, of course, after the Balkan conflict, where leaders were held to account. Do you know what? I think all of that's premature, frankly. I think we've got to think about how we get out of the situation that we're in. And anything I can think, Will, is the only way that Putin stops is if he's brought down from within.
And that will be virtually impossible. We've got to remember he was the head of the KGB, or the FSB as it's now known.
Yeah.
He will have so much protection around him that I don't think we could ever see a coup taking place.
Unless those very close to him turned, and that's not going to happen in a hurry.
Yeah.
You never know, though. Fraser asks, do you think it's appropriate that Prince Harry's security, when he returns to the UK, be funded by the taxpayer? Now he's deserted the royal family. As I understand it, what Prince Harry wanted was police protection, and he was happy to put a contribution in towards it.
Yeah, that's how I understand it.
Yeah, is that unreasonable?
It is unreasonable. He can't do that. I mean, and to be honest, if he has a good private security company, and I might know of one, Nigel, possibly
there we are. A pitch, Harry. If you're watching Prince Harry, that was a pitch. Prince Harry won't be watching this programme, and certainly Meghan won't. I guarantee you that. Another asks: Chinese, Indian, Mexican, Italian, or good old fish and chips? Well, I love fish and chips if they're good. If fish and chips is good, it's fantastic. It's the best fast food of the lot. But, got to tell you, a bit partial to an Indian. Will, what about you?
You know, I'm the same as you. If it's a rotten fish and chips, forget it. Yeah. I mean, that can ruin a very good evening.
But if it's a good one?
I'd say I do like a good curry, but again, it's got to be a good curry.
Neil asks, with the world sanctioning Russia, could this be called World War III? Not yet. Not yet. An incursion into NATO territory could turn it into something approaching that. We pray that isn't going to happen. Andrew asks, given the situation in Ukraine, what additional measures would you take if you was Prime Minister, if I were Prime Minister? Look, I think we have... quite interesting. I think Ben Wallace is coming out of this incredibly well, talking very logically. I thought that his thoughts about why we shouldn't implement a no-fly zone were actually very logical, very good. I have less confidence in the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, but there we are. Perhaps she'll grow on me as Foreign Secretary. I doubt it. Look, I think providing aid, providing weapons, if they're going to make a real go of this in Kyiv, they're going to need an awful lot of equipment, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest challenges they've got right now, Nigel, is from what I'm hearing from my local assets, is that cities are being cut off, main supply routes are being cut off. They're starving people in those enclaves which are now getting Russian control around them. This makes it very difficult for resupply of weapons, munitions and everything else. So it's a challenge.
There's still a gap there. There's a 27-kilometre gap to the south of Kyiv at the moment. We've got to get some stuff in there as fast as we can. Yeah. That's it. We're done for the evening. I'm back with you on Monday evening. Coming up next, Mark Dolan. First, though, let's have a look at the weather.
Good evening. Light winds creating a slow-moving weather picture at the moment, which means for some, particularly in the east, tomorrow will be wet and dismal, whereas in the west it should be reasonably bright with some sunny spells. Here's the big picture. These weather fronts have been draped across the country, kind of just stagnating through the day today, and they're going to stick around during tomorrow as well, making for a dull, damp evening over eastern Scotland and northern England. The rain is easing off overnight across Wales, but staying dank and drizzly over the Midlands. Misty, murky conditions. Pretty poor on many roads, particularly the M6 this evening, but increasingly the A1M also with a lot of spray and surface water. Further west, clearer skies will allow maybe a touch of frost in Northern Ireland, but mostly we're staying above freezing. But it's not going to feel very pleasant under that zone of wet weather over eastern Scotland, northeast England during Friday. Rain at times over the East Midlands, East Anglia, perhaps the southeast, whereas much of the west will be dry and bright, some sunny spells. Just a few showers for Northern Ireland, South Wales and southwest England. It's in the south where we could reach double figures, but stuck under that rain band, as I said. Feeling pretty bleak, 5, 6, 7 degrees at the very best. That zone of rain isn't really shifting very far either during tomorrow evening, sticking across these eastern parts, and if anything, hinting at coming back as we head into the weekend. Clearer skies across Scotland and Northern Ireland mean a touch of frost here to start Saturday, but we should see plenty of sunshine here on Saturday. Southeast Scotland could be a bit dull and damp, and certainly the bulk of the Midlands, eastern England, seeing a lot of cloud, rain and drizzle on and off during Saturday, and again, as a result, feeling pretty cold, especially on some of those North Sea coasts with the breeze off the sea. But even with some sunshine, temperatures only 8 degrees in Glasgow and Belfast, and maybe only 6 or 7 on Sunday. Most places looking dry and bright on Sunday, but feeling cold, certainly across England, with that easterly breeze.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions